Welcome, everyone, to the Solution Summit. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Patricia Campanile, and I am excited to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Eleanor LeCain, who is the visionary, the creator, and the solutionary who developed the Solution Summit. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, as this is a second segment, the Solution Summit is a 4-day hybrid event that's broadcast live from the House of Representatives, which is very exciting, on Capitol Hill. It's available to everyone and the public for free. We are living in chaotic and uncertain times, and the focus of the Solution Summit is to bring visionaries, or as Eleanor termed, solutionaries, with bold solutions that address real crises, but also the underlying causes of and bringing us together with each other and decision makers to create real lasting change. The Solution Summit is focused on 4 particular areas. The other day, we joined together for a very inspiring summit on climate solutions and the climate crisis. And today, Eleanor will be focusing with an amazing panel on broadening prosperity in America and the world. I am honored to introduce Eleanor and would like to share something about who she is, where she comes from, and her vision for creating this amazing summit. I would invite you, as I'm doing the introduction, to put in your name and where you're from so that we can all stay connected and get to know each other during our time today. So Eleanor LeCain is an advisor to the U.S. and international policymakers, candidates, and decision makers, as well as an author and speaker about breakthrough solutions. Eleanor builds on decades of experience in government and campaigns to show practical pathways toward a better America and a new world. Ms. LeCain served as the Massachusetts state government as an assistant secretary of state. She was executive director of the Blueprint 2000, leading strategic planning for 5 state governments, which had a $19 billion budget. Her book, Breakthrough Solutions, How to Improve Your Life and Change the World by Building on What Works, was forwarded by the Dalai Lama, and personally is a very inspiring and very important book. Her second book, The Mayor's Guide to Accelerating Gender Equality, provides an action-oriented, improved conditions for women and girls, and was created in collaboration with the U.S. Conference of Mayors. Ms. LeCain served as top advisors on policy and strategy to many candidates and of government officials, from city councils to Secretary of State, even to a presidential campaign. In 2022, Eleanor, when the election crisis was threatened to take over elections, she was instrumental in electing secretaries of state, committees to election integrity, and really stands for that in her passion and her purpose. Eleanor's international work includes advising the Kyoto Businessmen's Association in Japan and Green Business Opportunities, and the Japanese Parliament on policies on green business and job creation. Eleanor has advised members of the South Korean Parliament on energy policy and had leadership roles for conferences with women in the Middle East and ran seminars on leadership from Afghanistan to the United States. As host of a weekly solution-oriented radio show, All Together Now, Eleanor has interviewed cutting-edge thinkers and activists about transformational leadership, pro-democracy movements, climate action, and more on PRN Radio worldwide. Eleanor LeCain graduated from Yale College and the University of California Law School at Berkeley. Eleanor lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband and her daughter, and I am honored and excited to invite you to the Solution Summit and introduce Eleanor LeCain. Eleanor, thank you so much. Welcome.
you so much, Patricia, and happy birthday.
Thank
I'm
you.
so delighted you were willing to share some of your birthday with us today. And it's great to have that birthday energy as we're giving birth to solutions for a better world. So thank you
Absolutely.
so much.
You're welcome, Eleanor. I couldn't think of a better place to start my birthday. So thank you all and welcome everyone. Enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank all of you for being here. We are broadcasting live from the U.S. Capitol, bringing solutions for broadening prosperity to decision makers at every level and citizens across the country. I'm going to give you the story behind the summit. I'm going to offer a framing of the root causes of economic insecurity and key solutions to broadening prosperity. And then I'm going to introduce you to the people who are already working on those key solutions. So, the story behind the summit. As Patricia mentioned, I was in charge of strategic planning for the state government of Massachusetts, and I learned a ton about every area of public policy. And for years, I kept searching for what were the policies and programs that could help improve people's daily lives. How are we going to create good jobs, have quality education for all, enable us to breathe clean air and drink clean water, have enough money to pay the bills without too much of a struggle, and hopefully have some to put away for secure retirement. So I went on a treasure hunt. I went looking for the best of what's working in the United States. And I thought I might find a few here and there. I was amazed. I found solutions everywhere. And I wrote a book about some of the best of what's working in America. It's called Breakthrough Solutions: How to Improve Your Life and Change the World by Building on What Works. And I'm honored to say there is an introduction to that book by the Dalai Lama. I began advising candidates and elected officials on solutions oriented policies, working at the local, state, and national level. Last year, I realized the country is in such a state that helping a handful of candidates get into office and do good work was not enough. So I decided I would offer what I've learned and what I know to all candidates and all elected officials at every level and all Americans across the country for free. So I created this Solution Summit as a platform to share the solutions I've discovered and to give visibility to the people who are offering them. You know, we live at a time of great peril and great promise. We have multiple crises challenging both the United States and the entire world. It's not an exaggeration to say the survival of our country, our species, and our planet is at stake. If you're anxious or scared, it's understandable, and you have a lot of company. Many people are suffering from the climate disasters, from financial stress, from illness, and from anxiety about our country and the polarization and hostility that we're experiencing. The good news is we have solutions to all these problems. In fact, I would say there's a hidden solutions movement in the United States. So there is a hidden solutions movement in the United States where thousands and even millions of Americans are applying their intelligence and creativity every day to make things better. Some of them I call solutionaries. They're visionaries with solutions that could have a really big impact. The problem is that the people with the solutions often do not have the power to implement them. And the people with the power are often unaware that key solutions exist. So we're bringing together solutionaries with decision makers who have the power to implement the solutions. At this summit, will be participating the chair of the National Governors Association, the head of the Democratic Association of Secretaries of State, members of the New Deal Leaders Network of state and local elected officials, to name a few. Our intention is to encourage the rapid implementation of key solutions to our most pressing problems. We want to offer a beacon of light at a dark time. We want to bring hope that we can solve all our problems because we can. The truth is, this could be a good time. The breakdowns pave the way for breakthroughs to a better America and a better world at a scale we've needed for a long time. The solutionaries you'll meet here offer big, bold ideas that can help bring systems change. And they will offer smaller yet impactful actions. We'll answer the question I get all the time, which is, what can I do? We'll provide some practical steps that will make a difference. And I hope you find one or more ideas for action that you can take from the Solutions Summit. This is the second in a series of 4 programs. The first one was on climate solutions, which was fabulous. So I encourage you to check that program out when we get the recording available. And then today we're addressing broadening prosperity. Next Tuesday, we'll talk about how we can improve our health. And then next Thursday, how we can strengthen our democracy. So the focus for today is, how do we broaden prosperity? How do we create greater economic security for more people? The flow of the day will go like this. I'll give you first a brief overview of the problem of economic insecurity. Second, tell you about some underlying root causes that brought us to our current predicament. And third, offer some key solutions that we can implement to broaden prosperity. Then I'll introduce you to solutionaries who are already working on some of those key solutions. So first, a brief overview on economic insecurity. What's the problem? Problem is that the majority of people in the United States today are struggling to make ends meet. Over 70% are anxious about having enough money. While we think of our country as mostly comfortable middle class, a recent report shows more than 6 in 10 Americans do not have $1,000 for an unexpected expense. And nearly 4 in 10 Americans can't pay an unexpected expense of $400 in a month, according to the Federal Reserve. Working families are struggling to pay basic expenses of housing, food, and health care. They face rising prices driven by food, energy, and housing. And now rising interest rates make the cost of buying cars and houses even more expensive. So how are people paying their bills? A lot of people make ends meet by going into debt. Personal credit card debt has been rising, and according to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York this week, personal credit card debt is over $1 trillion. Predatory financial institutions charge high fees and fines for access to money. And even seemingly secure middle-class people can be one illness away from bankruptcy. Financial challenges are generally worse for women, people of color, young people, and seniors. Meanwhile, the top 1% own more wealth than the bottom 90% of people combined. There is a huge concentration of wealth at the very top. So, how did we get into this situation? Well, I'm going to tell you 3 of the root causes underlying this widespread economic insecurity in the wealthiest country in the world, I might add, by far. So, root cause number 1, it's a mindset that has driven policy choices made over decades, and that is this belief in trickle-down economics, that we should let the market run without any government guardrails. The basic idea was give more money to the rich and it will magically trickle down to others. but it does not. And the approach has failed for the vast majority of Americans while making the rich even richer. A second root cause of economic insecurity is that wealthy individuals and corporations use their money to influence government policies, to shape the tax code and other policies to favor the already rich. This leads to tax breaks for the rich, putting more of the tax burden on the middle class who are less able to afford it. It leads to jobs being moved overseas, with U.S. taxpayers subsidizing the loss of jobs. A third root cause of economic security is a tax on unions. Union jobs generally pay better with better working conditions, but rules were changed that made it harder for unions to organize. So the percent of the unionized workforce that was 33% in the 1950s has dropped down to about 10% of a unionized workforce today. So, what are the solutions here? I'll offer you three key solutions that can broaden prosperity. One, shift that mindset from trickle down to bottom up, directly strengthening the middle class and working families. And there are some very good groups focusing on that. I hope to have conversations about that more in the future. A second key solution to this economic insecurity is good jobs, strong unions, and fair taxes. That is essential. And there are many good groups working for that. The AFL-CIO has experienced a real resurgence in the labor movement, as you can see by recent strikes by auto workers, teachers, nurses, Starbucks workers, even the Hollywood actors and script writers. So that is part of the solution. And then the third key solution to deal with this economic insecurity is we need to democratize the economy. We need to enable working people to have a greater share of the wealth and more control over their lives. It is this key solution that we're going to focus on today. I would love to hit all three key solutions, but in 2.5 hours, I figured it better to do one well, and hopefully we'll focus on the other key solutions in a future summit. So today the focus is on building a more democratic economy, and you'll meet solutionaries who are working to do that. We have an economist and visionary on community economics who will show us how we can shift focus and investment from Wall Street to Main Street. We have a financial expert and former bank president who is leading a national initiative to democratize the economy. Experts in local ownership are here who talk about the importance and the experience in communities for decentralized renewable power and local control of food. And finally, we'll introduce you to a solutionary who knows that small amounts of money can make a big difference in the lives of working people and has programs that do just that. The format will be, I'll introduce you to one of these solutionaries who will make a brief opening comment. We'll have a conversation for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. You are welcome to join the conversation with both comments in the chat and questions in the question box. So we're going to begin now with our first solutionary is Michael Shuman, who's going to talk to us about how the road to broader prosperity is Main Street. Michael Shuman is an economist, attorney, and leading visionary on community economics. He's an adjunct professor at Bard Business School in New York City and a senior researcher for Council Fire, where he performs economic development analysis for states, local governments, and businesses around North America. He's the author of several important books, including most recently, Put Your Money Where Your Life Is, How to Invest Locally Using Solo 401ks and Self-Directed IRAs, and also another book on the local economy solution, how innovative self-financing pollinator enterprises can grow jobs and prosperity. Michael Shuman, welcome to the Solutions Summit.
Great to be with you. I hope you can see me and hear me clearly, and it's a delight to be with you on this important day. And if I could, I take it that I can maybe give a couple of minutes of just introduction
Please do.
to the main points that I want to make. And if folks look at evidence, piles of evidence about what works in local economies, one of the things that you see is that most of local economies are local business. In fact, across the country, 60 to 80% of jobs are either in locally owned business or locally rooted enterprises or institutions like local government. We know that these entities are critical for economic development, and we know that these entities, at least once they get past the startup phase, are really quite competitive. In fact, we have some evidence that local businesses actually have higher profit rates generally than Fortune 500 companies. Now, given all that, we would expect that all of you who are really solutionaries in your own places, that all of you would be investing most of your assets in the 60 to 80% of the economy that is locally owned business. I can tell you, since we can't do the survey formally here, but I can tell you from doing this survey hundreds of times around the country, and in fact all around the world, it's a tiny number of us who are investing locally. And what this means is that all of us are systematically over-investing in Fortune 500 companies that are disconnected from the well-being of our communities and under-investing in the local business and other people and projects in our communities that are critical to economic success. And here's the basic point, which is if you are investing in the wrong things that are not leading to prosperity, don't be surprised when you don't get prosperity. If you can rechannel that investment into the people, projects, and businesses all around you that you love, you can make an enormous difference. And what I hope Eleanor and I will talk about in the next few minutes are specific examples of people and places that are doing that.
That's great, Michael. I love that. And this is the big shift that you talk about, and you've been talking about it for years, that we need to invest in Main Street, not in, Wall Street's got plenty of money, but let's invest in our communities. And can you talk a little bit about some examples that you know of where people are investing in local communities and then local growth is happening? I mean, as opposed to why should we be putting our money into McDonald's, for example? It's going all over the world and making the top 1% richer. How about investing in our hardware store in our community? Or what are some examples you know of where local growth is happening around the country?
So let me say that generally, I produce this newsletter called the Main Street Journal that comes out every other week, soon will be every week. And every issue is filled with a dozen examples that are answers to your question. But I'll pull out two examples that I think are particularly exemplary. So one is about 2 hours drive north of Seattle is a 10,000 person town called Port Townsend. And starting in 2007, Port Townsend created an entity called LION, which stands for the Local Investment Opportunity Network. And it's basically a potluck dinner where local investors and local businesses get together and they form relationships and they have informal discussions. Just that one very simple social invention has led to $1 million per year of new investment going into local businesses in Port Townsend every year since 2007. If you can imagine, taking that lesson from a 10,000 person town and scaling that to the, larger towns or cities that many of us live in, you can get a sense of what is possible when a community really focuses on this. Give you a second example. A colleague and I put up a very crude website in Baltimore called the Maryland Neighborhood Exchange. And it's just a listing of local investment opportunities that are available in Baltimore. And in 2 years of operation during COVID, we basically helped more than 70 BIPOC-run businesses in Baltimore raise through investment crowdfunding $4 million from 10,000 investors. And again, just simply letting people know what kinds of local investments are available, because most of us assume there's nothing available, makes an enormous difference in this happening.
That's fantastic. Those are really inspiring examples. And what would you recommend? We've got some leaders in government that are participating in the Solutions Summit. And I know you just wrote about this in your wonderful Main Street Journal, not Wall Street Journal, the Main Street Journal you do, which I love, and I encourage all our listeners to sign up for the Main Street Journal. You talked there recently about recommendations for policymakers, how you can stimulate the economy without raising taxes. So what do you recommend that our government people do? And either if you're a government official, listen and do it. If you're a citizen, listen and get your government official to do it. So what are you recommending, Michael?
Well, there's about 15 recommendations that I would give. We don't have time to talk about all of them, but let me just highlight one or two that I think are really exciting. So one is, while we're having the summit right now, the state of Michigan is holding final hearings on implementation of a bill that would create an investment tax credit for local investors. And basically, when the bill is enacted, and I don't think there's any question that it will be enacted because it has broad support from both Democrats and Republicans. When this bill is enacted, Michiganders will get a 50% tax credit off of their state taxes on every dollar they put into local businesses, up to about $3,000 or $4,000 per person per year. Now, that is a huge kind of incentive. And we know from a similar incentive that was put into Nova Scotia in Canada in the late 1990s, which evaluated, okay, the government gave up a little bit of tax money and jobs were created. And a recent study looking at that found that the cost per job created was about $500. So to put that in perspective, we have examples of hundreds of cities around the United States that were prepared to attract Amazon for literally $500,000 to $1 million per job. So this is a really cost-effective way of stimulating jobs in the local economy. So that's number one. Number two is we're seeing some really creative use of municipal bonds. Now, I do want to call out a very creative bond that was issued by a mayor in the 1980s, and that was a mayor named Bernie Sanders, and when he was mayor of Burlington, Vermont, and he used municipal bonds to raise, I think it was about $100,000 that went into the anchoring of a land trust, a community land trust, to make affordable housing available. That land trust has grown into an entity that is now worth more than $100 million over 40 years. and is providing housing for, I think it's probably close to 2,000 people. So it shows, how municipal bonds can be very powerful. Now, we've got across the United States, in states and counties, sometimes in cities, what are called green banks. Most of them receive their money exclusively from banks that are contributing money under the Community Reinvestment Act. But a good exception to that is the Green Bank in Connecticut, which has been issuing what they call green baby bonds, sort of building off World War II's baby bonds. And these are municipal bonds at a small denomination that grassroots investors can put their money into. And 2 years ago, they did their first issue of $25 million of green baby bonds to support solar and affordable housing. They sold out that bond issue in 48 hours. The demand was so high. So I think there's a lesson there for other state and local governments to start using municipal bonds more creatively to support these kinds of local investment initiatives.
That's fantastic, Michael. I love those examples, and they're so practical. I'm going to open it up now to our participants for questions and answers. Please put your questions into the question box, and Maisie is right here by my side. She's passing me index cards. We had one question already in from Mary Meyer, and it was, when will lawmakers ensure that affordable housing is really affordable for low and middle income residents? And Michael, I think you answered that question already, perhaps with the example of Mayor Bernie Sanders in Vermont. But did you want to amplify that piece or
Yeah, and I think
suggestion?
Yeah, so I think that what we are learning from a variety of examples is that locally owned housing, and that local ownership can occur in a variety of ways, tends to be less profiteering than housing that's, say, owned by private equity, and also housing that's owned by absentee landlords. So figuring out what are the institutions that can broaden the ownership base. And there's a wonderful example that we have from the Main Street Journal about two mobile home parks in California. And they were both in Northern California, pretty close to one another. So it's like an interesting social science experiment. One converted to ownership by the residents. And again, this is in the late 1990s. The other was originally owned privately and has since gotten private equity ownership. The former, over a 30 plus year period, has basically seen a 30% rise in rents, which is commensurate with inflation, more or less. The one that's under private ownership, private equity ownership, that has seen the rents go up by 120%. And so you can see lots of examples around the country where, if you want to stabilize housing prices, if you want to put a damper on one of the biggest causes of inflation, getting more housing into these structures of local control. And I think, to take it one step further, as the Bernie Sanders example shows, you can creatively mix government money with private money to make these kinds of ownership initiatives happen.
That's great. And another great example. Thank you, Michael. And I do want to point out, of course, Mayor Sanders, now Senator Sanders, has done a lot of innovative work to help broaden prosperity. And at the same time, the kinds of things you're talking about have broad appeal across the political spectrum. So, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, everybody can love the kind of thing you're talking about. And, I'm thinking, as you so powerfully express, that we need to invest in Main Street, not so much Wall Street, but Main Street, that we can do that as individuals. And also, if you're a mayor or a governor, we could figure out ways, like, for example, where do we put the tax revenue? If you're the mayor of a city, governor of a state, are you putting that tax revenue into a Wall Street bank? Or could you put that into a local bank or maybe even a publicly owned bank, as in the case in North Dakota? Could you speak to that issue of where the financing can come from, both individually and through government?
Yeah, so this is really important. And as you mentioned, we have one existing example of a publicly owned bank in North Dakota that's been operating for more than 100 years. Now, there's a lot of people misunderstand what the concept of public bank is, and they assume North Dakota is just operating an entity that's competitive with all kinds of private banks online or something. And that's not at all an appropriate description. North Dakota, like every state, and frankly, every city, gets money from taxes. They get money from government transfers from the federal government, and they have to put that money somewhere before they spend it. Usually, states and cities will put that money in some kind of global bank where it does really good economic development work in Malaysia or Korea, but it's not doing economic development work at home. And 100+ years ago, the state of North Dakota said, you know what? We should be putting that money on deposit in local banks and credit unions. And to this day, North Dakota has a really good availability of credit for its small businesses that has helped to contribute to its prosperity. Now, I will say that public banking like this has been taking off around the country. And where I am in California, our state about 2 years ago passed an enabling piece of legislation that allows, I think, up to about a dozen cities to implement public banks like this, and a half dozen have already taken some significant steps. And some cities, like those in the East Bay, in the Bay Area, have gotten to the point where they're actually hiring people to implement their banks.
That's fantastic. Very exciting. And of course, that's a model other states could do. We just have a brief time to wrap up this section, but if you could very briefly tell us, if you've got some money set aside for retirement and you're probably in, if you're invested, you're probably in an S&P 500 index fund or something similar. Like for me, where could I go? Where can our participants go? We take that money. I'd rather have it into my local community, or a local, some local business somewhere in the country. Is there like a community business S&P index fund version, or where would I turn to put that money invested locally?
So there's not an index fund yet, but I think there will be in the not too distant future. If you're looking for listings of local businesses that are available for investment, we have a listing in the Main Street Journal, and there are other websites like King's Crowd out there that provide some good listings as well. But I don't want people to overlook that sometimes the best local investments are in yourself or in your house. Like getting yourself out of credit card debt, every dollar you get out of credit card debt offers you a 25 to 30% rate of return in avoided interest. My wife and I created a solo 401k, which, because we have some income that we get from self-employment, and that solo 401k allows us to borrow money and pay ourselves back. So we borrowed money to put solar on the roof, and now instead of paying a utility $300-400 a month, we pay ourselves $300-400 a month, and soon, 4 or 5 years from now, we will have no utility bill whatsoever. I think that's the best rate of return anyone could get right now.
That's fantastic. Well, I so appreciate your great work, Michael. And just so our participants know, your session here is now over, but I'll be inviting you at the end of each session to help summarize our key learnings. So we'll see you again in just a bit.
Great. Can't wait to see you next.
Thank you, Michael Shuman. All right. Our next solutionary is Stephanie McHenry, who is the CEO of the Democracy Collaborative, a think and do tank that focuses on building community wealth. Before that, Ms. McHenry served as president of Urban Partnership Bank, where she managed assets of $75 million. And she was president of Shore Bank, which some of you may know as a leading community bank. Welcome to Solution Summit, Stephanie McHenry.
Hello, Eleanor. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you. And would you be so kind and just make like maybe a 4-minute opening remarks? By the way, I redid my script, and because of my Boston accent, I thought opening remark might sound funny. So, but it's real. So it's an opening remark. Go right ahead.
Sure. Well, I went to school at Dartmouth, so I heard a few Boston accents, as that was the closest city we could ever get to. But yeah, thanks so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to share time and space with you and your guests. I think the best way for me to start is just to tell you about my first encounter with the Democracy Collaborative, where I'm now CEO. It really started back in 2008 when I was president of Shore Bank in Cleveland. One of our initiatives was to do a business incubator, really an enterprise center through our nonprofit that was designed to attract companies and provide jobs for those local residents there in Glenville, which is one of the poorest neighborhoods in one of the poorest cities in the country. So there I sat, and Evergreen Laundry came knocking on our door because they needed space to start this worker-owned commercial laundry that was going to be servicing the hospitals in the next door neighborhood, University Circle. And I learned that it was an initiative to really try to capture some of the money that's already being spent, capture it for the local economy and capture it in ways that benefit local residents. And I thought, what a great idea. That's an amazing idea. And that really fit with certainly our mission at Shore Bank to create economic equity in a healthy environment. So I was happy that our organization was able to provide that space, and that indeed became the first site for Evergreen Laundry. So then fast forward to about 2017, and at that time I was Chief Financial Officer and Senior Vice President for Business Affairs at Cleveland State University, which is an urban university located right smack dab in the middle of Cleveland, servicing non-traditional students for, in large part. So not people that were coming to college to party, but people that were coming to college to really advance their lives and their careers, many of whom were already working with families. So there I sat at that anchor institution. And Ted Howard, one of the founders of the Democracy Collaborative, was coming on campus to do a TED Talk. And so I ran over there like a little groupie because I remembered my first encounter with them back in Glenville, and ran up to Ted and say, "Oh, you probably don't remember me, but I was at the bank when you came." And so we started a dialogue. And of course, I ended up on the board of that organization not too far later. But it really reminded me of another pillar of what we do, which is how do you get anchor institutions to behave in a responsible way and to reinvest in their communities. So, fast forward, I ended up on the board. Then I ended up Chief Operating Officer and Chief Executive Officer now. Long story short is what the Democracy Collaborative does has been consistent with many organizations I've had a chance to work with in terms of reinvesting in local communities and supporting them through some of the economic energy that's already there, which I think is one of my favorite parts about what we do. We don't have to try to go find a bunch of new money necessarily. It's really about how we spend the resources that are already with us. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's a great story. I appreciate that. And you're right. We don't need new money. It's about reinvesting the money we've got in a way that supports community wealth building and local investment. Can you talk a little bit about, this phrase, community wealth building? People may not know what that is. We know about if you want to build some wealth for yourself, there's a lot on that. But this concept of community wealth building, what is that? And how could community wealth building be a cornerstone for economic development?
Sure. So we first articulated the term community wealth building back in about 2005, we being the Democracy Collaborative. And what we were describing there is an alternative economic development model where communities have direct control over their assets versus having their assets be extracted outside of those communities. And through that control and ownership, to be able to provide more broadly shared economic prosperity at the local level. And that will also work to improve racial equity and ecological sustainability. So it's a new way of thinking about it. If you think about the alternative economic development strategy in many places, it's what we used to describe as smokestack chasing, right? So you go out into the marketplace, you take your pitch for your city and you go out to these big companies that are trying to find a spot to locate, and you beg them to come into your city, and you throw them tax breaks and offer all kinds of things, 90% of which never really materialize in terms of what they say they're going to do back to you. Because guess what? A few years down the line, somebody else is going to approach them with an even more attractive package. So that's been sort of traditional economic development. With community wealth building, we really look to capture the wealth and the economic energy at the local level and keep it local. So we've done that in a few places. The Evergreen Laundry that I described in Cleveland was really the first example of how that works. Since then, the model's been undertaken by a city in England called Preston, where they decided that they weren't going to gamble anymore on trying to bring in companies, but they were in fact going to create companies to deal with their needs internally. We've done some work at Chicago in their Office of Equity and Racial Justice, where they were looking for solutions for underinvested neighborhoods. How can they provide some economic stimulus there? So we were able to provide some models for them. And then just last week, I had the opportunity here in Cleveland to host the government of Scotland, where that entire government has said community wealth building is the cornerstone of their economic development strategy. So it's been taken up in a broad types of entities and municipalities. And we want to continue to do that to demonstrate that it's really feasible just about anywhere.
That's really exciting. You've now got an entire country. The country is Scotland. Go, let's build community wealth in Scotland. And I love what you said. I mean, you called this out. So many cities or states are trying to get the big guys like Amazon or big company throwing all these tax breaks on them. I mean, the whole point of having the companies there is to create jobs, create tax revenue. But sometimes they give away the store so much to get them in the door. It actually isn't that big of a lift. And then you end up with pressure on housing and lots more traffic. And was it really worth it? So I love your approach of community wealth building. And could you tell us, I don't know how far along Scotland is, but the concept of an entire country, basing its economic development on a community wealth building model, just how do you begin to wrap your mind about it? And it strikes me, it could be like a state. I mean, not to offend Scotland, but it's not
Sure.
a giant country like the United States, but it could be very similar to a state here, Massachusetts, Texas. And do you know yet, or are you just at the front end? How would you advise a government entity at that level how to focus on building community wealth?
Sure. Well, I think the way I'll answer that, Eleanor, is to tell you about the pillars, the 5 pillars,
Yeah,
if
go
that's
for it.
okay,
Yeah.
because
Yes.
that really describes a little better what I'm talking about. So the 5 pillars of community wealth building include fair work. I'm going to list them and then I'll go back to them. Locally rooted finance, just use of land and property, progressive procurement, and inclusive and democratic enterprises. So those are all things that can be done on a local level to the extent that people focus on them. So fair work, that could mean, for example, if you are a state and you need to procure things, you may insist that you only procure from companies that have a certain level of wage, that have fair work in practice. So by in that way, you start to change the behavior of some of the companies that want to do business with you, right? Locally rooted finance, that's really, it's a new old fashioned idea. When banking started, it was very localized, right? I mean, you had your local bank on the corner that was very much in tune with what was going on in that community and was there to serve it. As we know, as the industry has grown, it's become much different than that in many, many cases. But there are ways to go back and reinstate sort of that community focus. We know about community development financial institutions that were created by Treasury back in the mid 90s that have that purpose, to get very local about servicing what's needed. So that, so again, cities, states can choose to support those types of organizations rather than other types of banks. Just use of land and property. I know in Cleveland, we have a lot of vacant land. And one of the issues is, who gets to control that? Unfortunately, when the stock market wasn't performing, there was a lot of capital out there, and a lot of it came racing into town for us in ways that's not healthy, because they were buying up properties and then not taking care of them. You sort of squeezing all the blood out of them and leaving them in not good condition. So any city or state can decide to put policies in place that have certain requirements for whoever might get control of that property to behave in a responsible way. Progressive procurement's a very easy one. I've alluded to that a couple of times. Cities and governments buy a lot of stuff, spend a lot of money. And, for example, in the case of the Evergreen Laundry, before Evergreen won the business, it was some international publicly traded company that was performing that work, not leaving anything in the local community other than a few wages, not even necessarily taking good care of the business and the property and the people. So for Evergreen to come in as a worker-owned organization, provided a different procurement opportunity for those hospitals that was more in line with their values. So cities and states, municipalities can align their procurement with their values. If you're writing the check, you can make the rules, right? You can say you must do this, this, and this, right? If they want to do business, they do it. And then finally, just this whole idea of ownership, worker-owned companies. There's a huge opportunity as the baby boomers now are reaching retirement age, and a lot of companies that have done well over the years don't necessarily have an heir or someone to automatically take over if their kids aren't interested, et cetera. So why not create incentives and provide support for the workers in those companies to take over as owners or other more democratic forms? So yeah, all these things are feasible at a very local level.
Right. That's exciting. I'm going to invite our participants to start putting your questions in the question box. And as you're doing that, I'm going to ask that we run a tape. We invited your colleague, I interviewed your colleague, Marjorie Kelly, recently, and there's a little, like a 2-minute clip I just want to show. I asked her, what the key action should recommend to broaden prosperity. So we're going to play that 2-minute clip and then go to the Q&A. So, and it'll be just a little, take a minute to get it queued up. So we're just going to have a little brief silence and then the tape.
Great.
If you were talking, if you had 5 minutes with President Biden, what would you say to him are the top 3 things you think he needs to do about our economy to make this work for more people? He's genuinely committed to building the economy from the middle class out. and he's done a huge amount in his time in office. What are the top three things you would recommend that the president do to help democratize the economy?
The first thing I would say is let's make community wealth building the premier form of local economic development. Biden has taken a step toward this. He's put community wealth building into his economic development plan. Let's make that more concerted. Perhaps there's a center for community wealth building that can take this model out to cities across the country, or funding for that. So that's the first thing I would do, community wealth building and economic development. The second thing I would say is let's support transitions to employee ownership. Let's make workers owning their firm part of the American dream in the same way that Americans owning their own home is part of the American dream. Let's put some SBA type loan guarantees behind funds that will buy and convert funds to employee ownership. That's the second thing that I would say. And the third thing I would say is let's loosen up local investing. So many of us, if we're fortunate enough to have an investment portfolio, we're sending all of our money to Wall Street. We're all investing in Google and Amazon, and we can't invest. We cannot invest into the businesses right next door because the mechanisms aren't there. So let's enable more local investing. Those are the three things that I would say. And let me add a fourth, Eleanor, if I can cheat a little bit here. Let's rein in private equity. Because while we build the positive, we also have to stop the extraction by, and private equity is the poster child for massive extraction. And Elizabeth Warren has created legislation that would rein in private equity. So let's do that at the same time.
That's great. Well, thank you for that clip, and I'm going to invite back to the stage Michael Shuman to join us with our Q&A here. And Michael, do you have any comment or question on Stephanie McHenry just laid out a fabulous plan for how to build community wealth and lots of good examples. Now we got a whole country, Scotland, doing it. You have any question or comment?
Well, the one question I have is, and I know Stephanie has a good answer to this, but maybe to share a little bit more about how the work in Preston evolved, because it's such an impressive story, and maybe just getting a few more of the particulars known by the audience here might get some people started down that road.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. It's good to see you. I know just enough to be dangerous about that, but I'm certainly happy to tell you some of what I know. I do think that the origin of that effort was exactly what I described at the beginning, that they as a municipality had bet a bunch of money and time and energy on attracting a particular player, a big company, to come in the town to replace some, hundreds of jobs that had been lost when the last company left, right? And then I think when they weren't successful at doing that, it really caused them to pause and say, is this really the right thing we should be betting on, right? Let's try to figure out how we can build some of this economic energy on our own. So I think they realized how much money they were spending as local government and as sort of local anchor institutions. So they got the anchor institutions involved, the eds and meds, local government. If you add up the spending there, that's a lot of money. And they figured out how to create enterprises that could tap into that. I believe they started a public bank to say, rather than, going out to the Wall Street investment bankers to finance big public projects, why can't we do that ourselves? Why don't we take the dollars that we're circulating and make bets on our own big projects and perhaps have less of a financial return requirement on the transaction, because we're going to have long-term return on the impact of having those big projects done. So those are a couple things I would point to. And of course, worker ownership was a big part of the model as well.
Yeah,
Great.
I love the worker ownership. We haven't talked much about that. We do have there's a couple of questions I'm going to combine here. it's on this question of alternative money. What about alternative currencies? And relatedly, Allegra's asking both these, can states break away from the US dollar and create their own source of financing? So either of you want to take that? Maybe Michael? Alternate
Well,
currencies?
yeah, I'll just say, I mean, yes, you can create alternative currencies. It is not that common in the US. That is, there's a lot of small scale currencies that are happening in neighborhoods and towns. The largest one is in Western Massachusetts, Berkshires. The challenge is how to really get it to be more than 1 or 2% of the transactions. And I think one of the key things that we've learned when local currencies had their sort of heyday during the Great Depression, both in the United States and in Europe, is that when local government or state government is willing to accept tax payments in the currency and is partially paying salaries in the currency, that bumps it up to a level of acceptance that really makes a difference.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm not sure, it's another question here. I'm not sure if legally we can speak to this, but Andrea's asking, is investing in gold or silver a good idea? We're not competent financial investment advisors, but I do know quite a lot of people are worried about the stock market. And I'm imagining, Michael, you might say, instead of the gold or silver, really the gold is the local businesses in your neighborhood. But what do you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's always some shiny object that's going to attract people to invest in, and gold, of course, is the shiniest and has the deepest historic roots. But the truth is that if you want a more secure investment portfolio, you want to diversify your investments. And Wall Street convinces us now that if you have big cap and little cap and growth and value stocks, stocks and bonds, that you're diversified. No, all of these things are connected to a Rube Goldberg global economy. And if you really want diversity, putting your money into local things that are not disconnected from the global economy, but more connected to your life, I think is a smart decision.
That's great. Well, we're kind of sadly wrapping this. I'd love to go on. So much richness in this community wealth building, but we're beyond that theme still in the next session. Before we leave, do either of you have like a major point, a key takeaway? Like what's your major learning from this segment? Michael?
Well, I took down 3 points from what Stephanie said, which I think was terrific. One is that ownership matters, local ownership matters. If you want community wealth building, you have to have control over your assets. The second is anchor institutions matter because you can mobilize more money, both in terms of procurement and investment quickly, if you get the big anchors, hospitals, universities, other forms of local government involved. And the third is that economic development is a choice. It's a set of choices. And most economic development now is still a variation of smokestack chasing. And the 5 criteria that Stephanie laid out for an alternative set of businesses and priorities is, I think, a great starting place for rethinking economic development.
Fantastic. And Stephanie, before we sign off, I'm giving you the last word. Any final comment?
Well, congratulations to you, first of all, for just bringing new ideas to the table. I think that's the biggest ingredient that we have to have if we want to work our way out of where we've worked our way into. Michael's talks about local support is at the core. I think we really have to be, some things won't be able to get solved entirely on a local level, but probably more than you think, right? If we're just conscious of it. And we have to recognize economic extraction We have to recognize when dollars and assets are leaving our communities and not coming back, and not just accept that as the way it has to be. Create local solutions that can really capture the economic energy that's already in play.
Well, that's great. Stephanie McHenry, thank you so much for being with us, the CEO of the Democracy Collaborative. Wish you the best in all your important work and hope to carry the conversation forward. And Michael Shuman, we'll see you again at the end of the next session.
Great. Thanks so much.
Now,
bye-bye.
Thank you. Our next solutionary, I'd like to welcome to the stage John Farrell. He is co-director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance and the director of the Energy Democracy Initiative. He is an expert in the economic and environmental benefits of local ownership of decentralized renewable power. He hosts the Local Energy Rules podcast, and he discusses monopoly power, energy democracy, and how communities can take charge to transform the energy system. John Farrell, welcome to the Solution Summit.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we're thrilled you're here. And, you know, it is entirely possible. We had a great conversation on the Climate Solutions Day. And part of that conversation was around the critical shift from fossil fuel economy, coal, oil, gas, into renewable energy economy, solar, wind, and water power. But we need to make that shift, but that's not a guarantee that there would be more broadened prosperity around the new renewable energy economy if we want to make sure it's not as concentrated as the oil companies have come and their control. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing from you. I welcome you to make a brief opening remarks, 4 minutes, and tell us a little bit more about the work you're doing.
I will do, Eleanor. Thank you so much. And I just have to confess, I do have a dog who's running my house, and I think my cat might be trying to open the door to outside, freaking the dog out. So if there's some barking in the background, I apologize. It's just one of those things about this era of being able to participate virtually, which I very much appreciate. So I just want to say broadly that this idea of local control over our economy, over the energy system I also like to think of it as self-determination, right? It means having meaningful choices. And I think saying that Americans like local control is sort of like saying they like freedom or apple pie or football. Like it's part of the definition of being American, and that Americans want local control over their energy future so that they and their communities can make decisions that matter to them. And at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, we really describe local control over the energy system as energy democracy. One of the things that surprises me, though, is that despite what I see as sort of like a fundamental preference among Americans for freedom or energy democracy, and the fact that energy is so essential to modern life, Americans are really surprisingly tolerant of a very undemocratic energy system. And it costs us a lot. I just have 3 brief examples. One, 12 of the largest electric utilities have shut off the power to US households 5 million times in the past 3 years, even though just 1% of their shareholder dividends could have covered the cost of keeping those folks connected. The second thing is that evidence from the Haas Institute at University of California, Berkeley, suggests that investor-owned utilities, which include those 12 that were cutting folks off, generally charge US consumers anywhere from $2 billion to $20 billion a year more than is necessary just to pad the profits of their Wall Street shareholders. And then the third thing is that we know there's been some great coverage of this in the past year, but utilities are using that publicly granted monopoly that they have and our own money for paying on our electric bills to lobby against things like local clean energy in order to protect their market share. So I guess what I'd say in summary to those points is just that I think Americans want more local control over their energy system. They want more energy democracy because lacking that benefit is really costly. And one of the things I've noticed is that, when corporations exercise too much power over other facets of our lives, we have reasserted the benefits of local control. We have the Federal Trade Commission. It recently filed suit against Amazon for abusing its market power and the way it was overcharging customers and abusing independent sellers on its platform. And the federal government believes that by confronting Amazon's monopoly power, they can reduce costs for consumers, restore the vitality of independent businesses, and protect democracy. And I think we can see the same kind of thing if we have more local control of our energy system. We can reduce energy costs because people can produce their own power. We can increase economic opportunity because if we build local energy, we have to have the jobs in those communities doing that construction, building those solar panels or wind farms. We can address historic harms to communities by replacing dirty energy with clean power, especially in tribal communities and communities of color that have suffered the most under fossil fuel economy. And of course, local control of our energy means we can accelerate our progress in fighting climate change because local energy is actually really fast to build. Like the solar panels on my house went up in 2 days compared to how long it takes for very large scale energy. So I'll just wrap up my opening remarks with a highlight from a recent report that we published called Advantage Local. And in it, my colleague wrote, quote, "If all small solar installed in the United States in 2021 had been locally owned, it could have created almost $7.5 billion in extra value for its host communities compared to outside ownership." So we see local control as leading to energy democracy and just as part of the American way.
That's terrific. And I love the work you're doing there at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. And you make such a powerful case about the value of local control of energy. You just wonder, why isn't it everywhere? And can you give us a sense of scale? Like, do you know how much of the energy in the country is under local control and how much of it is kind of these big utility companies? Do you have a sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we have to recognize is that in a traditional fossil fuel economy, it was much more economical to build very large power plants. And so we concentrated capital and concentrated ownership in order to go that direction. So the story of the first half of the 20th century is basically getting bigger and concentrating ownership into larger and larger utilities, larger and larger power plants. And so local ownership was really hard. With renewable energy, though, the story is completely different. And that's one of the most exciting things about solar energy, which we talk about probably the most when we talk about local control, because you can have it at a scale of on your own rooftop, and yet the same panel that's on my roof can be part of a giant solar array that's owned by utility companies. Well, I don't know that I have an exact fraction for you. I would guess it's somewhere between like 20 to 40% of solar projects are built on like residential and commercial properties. They might not all be specifically locally owned, as in like I have title to those solar panels, but a huge fraction of the solar energy that we built and that we've put on the electricity system is locally owned. And because of the fact that it can be done at a large and a small scale. Of our other technologies, it's not quite as much probably. You know, wind power tends to have big economies of scale. You really want to be higher in order to capture that better wind resource. But with solar, the possibility is really there. And with things like energy storage and the way that we can use smart technology to combine customers together, we have the possibility of really serving a lot of our big needs, whether that's fighting climate change or just meeting electric grid needs by doing lots of small scale things, but in a very big way.
That's fantastic. And I know you wrote this atlas called the Energy Self-Reliant States, which is a state-by-state atlas showing the renewable energy potential in each state and how really every state could meet its own electricity needs with renewable energy inside its state borders. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. The funny thing is we've actually done 3 editions of that report, and it's been interesting just to watch the evolution over time with the improvement of technology. I think when I first published that back in 2009, about 2/3 of states could get to 100% of their electricity needs from in-state renewables. And thanks to the advancements in solar and wind technology, it's well over 100% now in just about every state. What I think the biggest lesson from that report, though, I mean, one is, I think for some people, it's still surprising to realize just how much resource we have in every place that we can tap into. That the earliest, information about Indiana, for example, they said basically there was no possibility to do wind power in Indiana at all. And now there's several hundred megawatts of wind power providing electricity to Indiana customers. But I think the real learning that I've had from doing that report and the work that we've done since is the problem that we have is this mismatch between the local resource that every state has to meet that need and lacking local control in order to tap that resource. Because the truth is that the folks who control the energy system, the utility companies, mostly investor-owned utilities that serve most Americans and that own most of the power generation resources, they're not so concerned about where we get that energy from. They're concerned about whether or not their shareholders will make money with the kind of energy that they're going to sell. And so they're fine with, we're going to buy coal power from North Dakota, or we're going to buy gas from overseas, or we're going to import gas from outside the state in order to fuel gas-fired power plants. And so the lesson I think from that report is, yes, it's really amazing what the potential is, but if we actually want to seize that potential, we really need to focus on what are the rules of the system that will enable us to do so, to take advantage of that opportunity in every state.
Well, that is so true. And it leads me to the next question. It's kind of a bigger picture, but on the same track. If you were advising government leaders, mayors, governors, on what needs to be done regarding local control of energy, what are your top recommendations for action for government leaders to encourage greater local control of energy?
I'll start at the most local level with mayors and cities. And the thing that I just want to say to any mayor that might be paying attention is figure out what leverage you have and wield every bit of it that you've got. Because the truth is, a lot of our energy decisions, our energy policy decisions are made at the state and the federal level, but cities actually have a lot of power. They have power over siting and permitting, for example. They have the power of the budget. And you have seen a number of cities, Minneapolis, Portland, Seattle, create climate-oriented funds that are all about capturing the value of that local energy resource and helping people reduce their energy bills and produce more energy locally. So figure out that leverage that you've got. And how can you push the utility company to help meet your local goals? Because the truth is, a lot of these utilities don't pay attention, but you can make them pay attention. And we've seen a lot of cities do that in some very impressive ways. Up at the state level, where we do more of our policy making around energy, I'd say one of the most important things that should happen and is happening is figuring out how to hold monopoly utilities accountable and to protect consumers. And we've seen legislation that passed just this year in Colorado, in Connecticut. It's being considered now in other states as well. It's often called utility accountability legislation. And it does some fairly simple but really important things, like say, hey, utility, if you're going to go join a trade group like the American Gas Association that's out there lobbying to burn more gas in a way that really harms our climate and our communities, you can't charge ratepayers for that. You have to pay out of your own shareholder pockets. Or if you're going to lobby our state government and ask for things like for subsidies for your gas plant or your coal plant or your nuclear plant, again, you can't ask ratepayers to pay for those kinds of things. And it includes some other provisions as well to ensure that utilities make investments that are more closely in the public interest, which has been really difficult. So I would say, absolutely, we've got to get folks paying more attention to the way that these utilities control and manage the system and take back some of that control. The second thing I would say, and this is certainly more ambitious, is to say we really need to restructure our electricity system more than we have already. So we got to start on it about 20 years ago, where we said, hey, maybe the one utility doesn't need to own everything, from the meter on our house to the power lines that go up to the power plant and the power plant itself. Maybe we could actually break up some of those functions to help reduce the power of that one entity. Well, the thing that we really need to do now is figure out how do we allow for competitive provision of services where the technology allows. We see in a couple of states, California and Texas, for example, they've been able to help avoid blackouts and to reduce energy costs for all consumers on the grid and save individual customers money who sign up to participate together as a group and to agree like, hey, I'm using this smart thermostat. I give this company the ability to like turn down my AC or something like that in response to grid needs. I get paid for that. And then the whole grid benefits because it reduces demand on the grid and avoids the use of really expensive power plants. So we need to get more of that going. And the sad truth is that utilities have blocked in most states the ability to have that kind of competition. And then the second and even more important thing is that we need independent oversight of the energy system, especially what's called the distribution grid. So if you think of the poles and wires that are like in your alley, in your backyard, around the city that you drive around, that's where all the exciting stuff is happening in the energy system. That's where we plug in community solar and rooftop solar and batteries and all that kind of stuff. And the utility still manages that as a monopoly, even though it has a terrible conflict of interest in wanting to actually prefer its own solutions and its own big power plants. And so we really need to think about, can we trust the utility to continue to be in charge of that? And when we've seen lots of evidence that they manage it poorly and to their own advantage, when we actually really need to use that system, that connective grid, that platform for everybody's benefit.
That's great, John. Well said. And we've got a question here. The title of the atlas that you publish is called Energy Self-Reliant States. That's the state-by-state atlas of renewable energy potential within each state. Can people find that on the Institute for Local Self-Reliance website, John?
Yes.
Yeah, check out that. It's an amazing group and been doing great work for 50 years. So I want to bring into the conversation now another solutionary, Anthony Flaccavento. John, stay with us. You're still on, but I want Anthony to join. Anthony Flaccavento is a farmer and rural development consultant from Abingdon, Virginia, in the heart of the Appalachian coal fields. He's the founder of Appalachian Sustainable Development, and he's focused most of his work over the past 4 decades on building healthier food systems and more diverse, locally rooted economies in Appalachia and around the world. He recently wrote a very exciting kind of outline of a program called the Rural New Deal. Anthony Flaccavento, welcome to the Solutions Summit.
Thanks, Eleanor. Really appreciate you having me here. And I actually have a few slides for my little 4-minute intro. And so I'm going to see if I can bring those up. Yep, real quick. I'm going to run through these very quickly and then look forward to the dialogue with you and John and the others. So I'm focused on rural prosperity and why it's important, not just for rural communities, but for all of us as Americans in this country. My organization, I won't talk much about, but our focus is on overcoming the rural-urban divide, a big part of which means bringing more prosperity to rural, because a lot of the anger and grievance coming out of rural and small town is in part based on economic decline. Now, Michael and John and Marjorie are all mentors to me, but a few quick slides about how we've failed economically. This slide looked at the growth in the population of our country between 1980 and 2016. We went from about 230 million to about 320 million. Pretty good growth, about 44%. But during that exact same period, our economy grew by almost threefold. Now that's adjusted for inflation. So again, when you look at that, very modest growth in population, quite a substantial growth in the economy, about 5 times greater. The question is, why aren't a whole lot of Americans a whole lot better off? And of course, as you've been saying, Eleanor, and the other guests, it's because trickle-down hasn't trickled down, that in fact, it's been a suck-up economy, moving wealth from local communities, local businesses, family farmers, and rural areas broadly to a small group of investors and corporations. Now, the whole deal with trying to build a more bottom-up economy is not just because we like the idea of mom and pop businesses, but in fact, we know from multiple studies, including ones done by ILSR and Michael, that there's tremendous benefits. This one was in the Economic Development Quarterly. They looked at almost 3,000 counties across the country, and they found that basically, if the county had a lot of small, independent, locally owned businesses, they had positive per capita income growth during the period they looked at it, whereas a dependence on a few big non-local businesses had a negative effect on people's incomes. We also have a range of studies that look beyond the economics. A fellow named Troy Blanchard had 2 of them, one in which showed that the more economic diversity you had in your local economy, the healthier people were, the healthier the overall population. And similarly, the more diverse, locally rooted economies had much higher rates of civic engagement, of volunteerism, even voting. So real quickly, what are some of those things in rural communities? What is some of the innovation that is part of this emerging local economy? Well, part of it, a big part, has been investing in local foods, and that includes local food infrastructure. My little town of Abingdon on the left has one of the best farmers markets in all of Virginia because we scraped together investment to build a pavilion and recruit the producers, and now it's an extraordinarily important place of commerce. The Common Market, which has a food hub in Philadelphia, also opened one in Georgia. And they have had tremendous impact in moving larger quantities of food from local farmers to bigger markets. We're also seeing innovation in energy efficiency. John and ILSR of course, are working on all of the energy economy. But this is one example of a very successful business in Radford, Virginia, called Acme Panel, producing these super energy efficient and storm resistant structures, homes and commercial buildings, from SIPS panels, or structurally insulated panel systems, another locally owned, innovative local business. We have innovation going on in local capital. Michael is the grand poobah of local capital, but one investment from my own area is this fellow, Dwayne McIntyre, and his homegrown business called Goshen Farmstead. 4 years ago, when they wanted to expand their dairy business and they needed about $100,000 in capital, they turned to their customers, people like my wife and I, who were also selling at the market, and about a dozen other local families that were already customers of theirs. We, together with Dwayne, financed his dairy. They're now producing incredible milk, yogurt, buttermilk, and they're highly successful. A couple of other notes is that these kinds of things are happening everywhere. But too often, these innovators, like the folks I've already shown, or Bren Smith, who has a whole system of vertical ocean farming, they're missed because of the reasons that Michael and John have outlined here. So we know that there is, in fact, a lot of local solutions. And that's why we joined forces with Progressive Democrats of America to write this Rural New Deal. It's essentially a big platform of where and how to invest to bring about more rural prosperity. And it is both a big call for long-term investment in rural economies, infrastructures, a healthy land base. But within the 10 pillars, there are very specific recommendations, which are all grounded in the kinds of experiences, the kinds of enterprises that I just showed as a tiny sampling of what's cooking. So that's it for my quick intro. I think I was close to 4 minutes, and I'll be happy to chat with you now, Eleanor.
That's great. I appreciate that. And I wanted to bring you and John together around the theme of the local control of energy and local control of food. And I know you work on both. My main question to you, Anthony, is most Americans live in cities now, and there's been kind of this sense of the actions in the cities, and then there's the few farmers that are still left there, and but kind of almost dismissing the rural areas. But it's so essential. This is where our food comes from. What are we going to do without the farmers? But I know you've devoted your life really to helping rural areas get stronger. If you could just say very briefly, 1 minute or less, why do rural areas matter to someone who lives in a city?
Yeah, so a couple of obvious reasons. You could probably list more. But number one is, as you said, Eleanor, even though the population has shifted and is now overwhelmingly in urban and suburban areas, the fact of the matter is most of those communities depend, if not entirely, a great deal on rural areas, not only for their food, certainly their food, but also their fiber, their materials, their energy, and for basic ecological services. If we have a degraded landscape, like some parts of Appalachia are after the coal industry's movement, we have much less capacity to clean our water, to filter our air, and to suck some of the carbon out of the atmosphere and put it back into the soil where it's much needed. So number one, we all have to have healthy ecosystems to survive, basically. And that's not to dismiss the importance of things like urban farming and the various efforts around that, but we are still quite dependent. The second thing is the politics. And the fact of the matter is, if you abandon rural for long enough, you piss a lot of people off. And when you do that, you also shift our politics to one where it becomes much more difficult to both elect people and harness the kinds of policy that would actually not only help rural communities like the Rural New Deal, but would help us pass the kinds of legislation we need to tackle income inequality, to tackle climate change, et cetera. So we have now a politics that's so skewed and so polarized, in part because of the 40-year neglect of rural areas.
Right. Thank you, Anthony. And John, I want to ask you, you are working with local control of energy all across the country. Obviously, some of these rural areas have huge amounts of land, maybe for wind power or water power. Would you like to comment at all on what Anthony said, or how does this relate to your work on ownership of decentralized renewable energy?
Well, I really appreciate Anthony talking about rural areas as sources of energy, because the truth is you can't, in most urban areas, produce enough electricity from solar panels on roofs and parking lots and whatnot to meet your overall energy needs. You're going to be an energy importer, and you're going to get that energy from rural areas. It's pretty hard to site a wind turbine, for example, a 20-story wind turbine in a downtown area. And so I think the issue there is, and I think this is kind of part of the political conversation and the attitudes in the discourse, and it sort of even showed up in your question about why should we care about rural areas, is if we're only thinking of rural areas as a place where we extract energy in order to supply our cities, the politics of it are not going to work. And we're going to be very vulnerable to what we're already seeing is misinformation campaigns run by the fossil fuel industry. They send folks out to those rural areas. They lie about the dangers of solar and wind power and the harm that's going to do to those communities. And those communities look at folks from urban areas and environmentalists and whatever, and all kind of that whole roll up, and they say, well, those folks aren't looking out for us. In fact, they're willing to say they want transmission lines and these big industrial wind farms on our land, and they're not interested in whether or not we benefit from it. And so I think our orientation at ILSR has always been communities need to be able to benefit. They need to have some of that self-determination, some of that their own decision-making about what gets sited there, how much benefit can they get from it, how can it tie into their economic opportunity, how can it create jobs for them, so that the idea of building wind farms and solar farms and supplying renewable energy, among many other services rural areas supply to our economy, can be one where it's something that actually creates vitality for the rural economy and is not an extractive relationship with folks in urban areas.
Fantastic. I'm going to invite our participants now to any questions. Please put them in the chat in the question box. And I'm going to welcome back to the stage Michael Shuman, who I think, Michael, you know both these gentlemen. Michael, do you have any comment or question about what you're hearing from John and Anthony about the importance of local control on energy and food?
Well, I have a question for John. So, John, I moved to California 2 years ago, put solar on my roof, am keenly aware of the regulatory regimes here. And what I've learned is that in a state that is historically very pro-renewables, we are on our third regime of regulation, and each regime has been successively less friendly to people who want to put renewables on their home and more friendly to utility preservation. So what do you recommend we do about that? And is there a regulatory regime in another state that we should be pushing California legislators to embrace?
I wish I had a great answer for you, but I can stumble my way toward a good answer here. I mean, one of the key things, and this is something that we very much try to do at ILSR, is to at least help people understand why this is happening to them. And the truth behind it is, of course, that rooftop solar, when you are doing it in a territory controlled by an investor-owned monopoly utility, is a threat to their market share and their business model. And that is why we find states making moves to reduce compensation to rooftop solar participants, even in this climate crisis moment when we want as many people to invest as much of their own money in clean energy solutions as is possible. So it is really crazy that we are allowing that to happen. And it's really disappointing to see that in California. I actually just did a podcast recently with someone from Indiana who pointed out that in Indiana, where rooftop solar has basically just a drop in the bucket, they've already moved ahead and reduced rooftop solar compensation, kind of putting to the lie to the idea that has anything to do about cost to other consumers. So I think it really is about helping people understand the role that these investor-owned utility companies, sometimes multinational corporations, sometimes just like agglomerations of multiple utilities, the enormous political power they have. And I think people can be very receptive to that and understand like big corporations don't have our interests at heart. And I think I'll offer two very quick things in terms of solutions. One is Hawaii is the only US state that pays those investor-owned utilities on the basis of their performance toward the public interest, like facilitating more energy efficiency, more renewable energy, et cetera. The only state out of 50. Every other place, we pay these utilities for doing things that we don't actually want. And then the second part is something that I mentioned in my opening remarks or in response to Eleanor's question about what should we be doing, which is we need to pull from the hands of the utility oversight of that distribution grid to make sure that everybody has fair and non-discriminatory access. Because right now it's not really a market. It's a very distorted market controlled by an entity that has its own interests that are usually not in alignment with the public interest.
That's
And
great.
Eleanor, if I can maybe just ask a quick question of Anthony. Anthony.
Yeah, and then we've got some questions from the participants.
Great.
But
So
go
Anthony,
ahead quickly.
you're in Appalachia. The governor of Kentucky just won a resounding victory in an overwhelmingly red state. To what extent is his success reflective of what was in your plan?
Well, a guy like Beshear, whom I don't know beyond anybody else's understanding of him, is a politician that I think has managed 2 terms substantially because he really does put a focus on Kentucky's prosperity. And not to say that he hasn't taken positions on some of the hot button issues. Of course, there's all dimensions, housing, education, et cetera. But he seems to be of the ilk that we're starting to see more and more, and some of them are Republicans, they're not all Democrats, of state legislators who really prioritize these solutions, and particularly kind of bootstrap solutions. So I don't know Andy Beshear's specific economic development philosophy, but I do know that more broadly, the movement has begun to impact legislators at the state and sometimes federal level, and people with really important institutions like the Department of Commerce, EDA, the Appalachian Regional Commission, USDA. They've all been exposed to 20 years of local food, local economy kinds of success stories, and it's sort of softened up their resistance. Now, we're just this far along, and we should be way further down the road. There's still way too much investment in time and energy given to corporate subsidies and all that crap, but we really have progressed in building, I'd say, a cadre of both institutional people and electeds who really see this as a solution to a lot of our problems. So there is progress there.
That's great. Thanks, Anthony. And we've got a question here from Diane Collins. And I believe, Diane, you asked a question also on our Climate Solutions Day that I did not have time to get to. So we're going to combine them together here. The question is, do you ever meet with fossil fuel company executives to explore how we can have the energy issue work for everyone? And there was another question related, which is there any energy, any fossil fuel company that's doing anything positive? Because we're hearing, how they're going gangbusters to keep extracting the fossils to get us the fuel, and contributing to the greenhouse gases, creating the global warming, and then all these climate disasters coming from all of that. But is there anything good coming out of any of these fossil fuel companies? So I don't know which of the 3 of you feels competent to address that, but it's open to the floor.
I could take a quick stab and just say, when we have had transitions before on technology, we generally don't spend a lot of time consulting with the people who have the outdated one. So we didn't consult with the horse and buggy folks when we had automobiles, and we didn't spend a lot of time consulting with landline phone companies when we got cell phones. Because number one, they didn't have the technological expertise to really understand stuff, but also the institutions that they built up really weren't made to operate in that space. So we have seen some fossil fuel companies like BP, for example, make investments in renewable energy as well as their fossil fuel investments, but not anywhere near to the scale that would actually offset their own contributions to climate change. And so I don't think we should look for fossil fuel companies to solve this thing. I think it's the wrong way to go, and that we really need to look to the innovative companies that are developing renewable resources as the ones that can lead on this and figure out how to slow down those fossil fuel industries.
Right. And I think there was a moment. I mean, the fossil fuel companies we now know have known for 50 years that what they were doing was damaging to the planet and the atmosphere. And there was a moment, I think, in maybe the 1970s, 80s, where you mentioned BP. They said, oh, we're going to be the beyond petroleum fossil fuel company, and we're going to invest in the future of clean, green energy. And they kind of put up a lot of smoke and mirrors, and there was some investment in renewable energy, but it was really not. And there was one of the executives in BP came out and said, I was excited to participate in helping this fossil fuel company now go green. And I realized it was mostly a big PR thing. So I'm quitting. And so I'm so deeply sad that they had and still have an opportunity to be participants in moving towards green, clean economy, but instead they're digging down, literally, doubling down on the fossil fuel extraction and burning and doing all kinds of things. The single biggest reason we're so far behind on the clean energy is the blockage of the fossil fuel company, the fact that they fund climate deniers to go get elected at the state and federal level to block legislation that helps us make the transition we need to make from fossil fuels to clean, green energy. So I'm deeply sad about it, and but that is the reality. Another question here. This is probably for you, Anthony. As you increase rural farming, are you using non-GMO practices? That's the genetically modified organisms, which are kind of taking root in rural areas. And what do you think of the GMOs, and how big are they in our rural areas now? And what should we do about the GMO situation?
Well, that's kind of a mixed answer, really. The large commodity growers who are doing corn and soybeans and a few other big crops, there's been a very rapid movement, although somewhat of a pushback towards genetically modified seeds in that. And I've been somebody who has fought that for a variety of reasons. I'm not so concerned about human health as some people are, but I do think the evidence about how that reduces the diversity of the seed stock, how it introduces even more monoculture, all that. I'm not a fan. I think there's strong arguments against GMO, but the fact of the matter is it has largely supplanted traditional hybrids in corn, soybean, and a few other big crops. The flip is that where you're talking about local food movement, you're talking about a lot to do with livestock and really healthy ways of having multi-species grazing that are good for the environment, good for the animals, and good for the food products that come out, whether it's dairy or meat or eggs. And you have a lot of movements on smaller traditional grains and produce. So the local food industry is really very, very little GMO. There's a few local growers that might use GMO corn, sweet corn, but so far, because of consumer demand for organic or non-GMO, the local food movement has really stayed away from them. And if I can, Eleanor, I'll also respond a little to a question I saw about industrial symbiosis. I'm not 100% sure what that means, but two things that I think get at that. One is an interesting example from North Carolina, which is called the Industrial Commons, which is an outgrowth of a very innovative cooperatively owned business called Opportunity Threads. They now have a cluster of textile-oriented businesses that support each other. Some of them do some joint marketing. Some of them do some business-to-business purchasing. But this Industrial Commons sort of takes a cluster of business and improves each one while magnifying the opportunities for new one and bringing back an industry that everybody thought was dead in North Carolina, textiles. We do a similar thing in Appalachia in the form of infrastructure. The food hub that I helped start 23 years ago, Appalachian Harvest, is still going strong. And food hubs basically create an essential piece of infrastructure that allows a whole bunch of local farmers of all kinds of products access to big markets without having to do their own cooling systems, their own grading, their own trucking. And so that's another way that you kind of bring multiple businesses together in a way that really helps them, but without them having to expend a lot of capital to gain access to these bigger, better markets. So there's actually quite a bit of that going on in rural America.
Yeah, that's terrific, Anthony. And it was 1992. I was the top policy advisor and to the acting governor of Massachusetts. And one of the programs I encouraged her to get behind, which she did to her credit, was zero waste. And at the time, we took huge heat from the Associated Industries of Massachusetts, was highly critical, saying you'll never get to zero waste. So you're going to look silly. Don't talk about it. But my basic point was you can take the waste of one company or one activity, and that becomes the fuel to feed another company or activity. And you do that enough, you can have zero waste. And I think that's kind of where we want to head. So we're not, not having more waste to dispose of. I have a question I have never heard before. I'm going to toss it out. Is there any news on U.S. exploration into the use of white hydrogen, a continual energy source that requires no processing? I have heard of energy coming from the air. I have not heard of energy coming from white hydrogen from Kathy Johnson. Any of the three of you gentlemen able to deal with white hydrogen and energy?
I've not heard of that one, but there is sort of a joke among the energy policy wonks out there about all the rainbow colors of hydrogen. And I think the important thing to keep in mind here is that there are a lot of technologies that sound really exciting when we first hear about them. And it's not to distract too much from the fact that most of the technologies we need to solve climate change already exist and are commercialized. We have solar panels and wind farms, we have batteries. So there will be some potential interesting, like maybe industrial uses of hydrogen that will be necessary to decarbonize those particular areas of our economy. But most of our success is going to be in using the electric grid that already reaches everybody, making the power that comes from that electric grid low or zero carbon by putting in lots of renewable energy, and then using it for as many different things as we can, from homes to businesses to industry. So I think it's important for people to put it in the proper context. I haven't heard of white hydrogen specifically, but I also don't spend too much time on things that are sort of exciting and shiny at the expense of things that are already making a huge dent in our climate problem.
Terrific. Thanks, John. And I would be remiss if I didn't ask Anthony the question I'm asking every solutionary coming to the summit, which is, what is the top action you would advise government leaders to take, in this case, in order to encourage more local control of food and energy?
Yeah, thanks, Eleanor. Our Rural New Deal has 10 pillars, but probably, I think, the single most important of all of them is the idea of simultaneously tackling antitrust and really going after corporate monopolization, corporate control, and real support for local independent businesses, whether they're a small manufacturer, like I mentioned in North Carolina or Radford, Virginia, or whether it's farmers or even a downtown retailer. Too often, the people that advocate to fight big corporations are not tuned in to the tremendous potential for local business and don't themselves support them. They shop on Amazon and then talk about the corporate takeover of America. So we need to connect those two. And it's really encouraging just how much the Biden administration has done that. They've really gone after antitrust enforcement and strengthened those laws like nobody's done in 40 years, in my assessment. And simultaneously, they are trying to get much more investment to small businesses and to level the playing field there. So I think if there was just one piece of the Rural New Deal that was adopted, if we put real energy into the two sides of that coin, it would make an enormous difference.
Great. And Anthony, you referred to the Rural New Deal. Where do people find that? Like, what website can they go to read it?
they can go, first of all, they can contact me, which is just Anthony at Rural Urban Bridge, but they can go to the Rural Urban Bridge website, Ruby for short, ruralurbanbridge.org, and they can also go to the PDA America, the Progressive Democrats of America. It's up in full on both. By the way, it's only about a 20-minute read, so don't feel like you're going to get bogged down in some 200-page document. It's kind of short and sweet.
It is, and it's right to the point. It's very clearly written. It's exciting. I think we need to have more attention of rural areas, and the rural-urban connection really help people understand, how dependent we are and how much we need each other and celebrate the connection. John Farrell, we're about to close our session. I'm wondering if you had any closing comment you want to make sure gets in the mix before we move on.
I would just want to uplift what Anthony just said about antitrust and confronting corporate power. That it is, I think, a through line between all of the different elements of successful local economic development, of local control over our economy, that we have allowed corporations to get too big through 40 years of neglect of antitrust policy that was designed specifically to protect our local economies and our democracy. And the more we can do about that, the better.
Right. And we have some exciting news from Maine, right? What happened this week in Maine about local control of power?
There was a ballot initiative that sadly failed in order to transform two investor-owned utilities into a consumer-owned utility. I think it's a good lesson, though, of the fight that we're in, that the local advocates were outspent $40 million to $1 million in that battle. A ratio that is actually more extreme than most of the other kinds of fights we've had over local power, and reflective of the fact that company had resources. It's a multinational company and had resources it could draw on from all across its businesses. The success, though, was that there was one element on the ballot that would prohibit in the future foreign-owned companies from spending money on ballot initiatives in Maine. So if they take another run at it, maybe they won't be outspent quite so badly by the corporate interests that wanted to protect their turf.
Thank you. And I raise it because I think it's symptomatic of the battle that's happening. This is a battle for power, literally and figuratively, as we're shifting into the clean, green, renewable energies. There's a battle for who's going to own those and control them. And, so it's something it's great for local communities to be aware of, and states, just like, let's make sure that the new emerging green economy is part of the community wealth building, not part of the extraction that we've had. And Michael Shuman, we have just a minute left here. If you want to tell us any key takeaways you have from this really rich conversation about local control of energy and food.
Well, I heard a lot of very hopeful things. I heard from John that local energy, we now know, there's more than enough of it to power every state in the country. We know that if states do this, they will build wealth, equity, and environmental well-being. And we know that the principal challenge is corporate power and how you structure a state's regulation of utilities or other energy entities to make sure that this revolution happens. And there was a very similar message, I think, from Anthony. He said, don't write off rural. Rural is extremely important, both politically and economically. There are lots of solutions happening at the rural level that not just rural communities, but urban communities should be interested in. Probably it makes sense to start with food. We all eat it. It's very important, very high in our consciousness. Food hubs are extremely important. But to keep in mind that just as in the case of energy, the principal problem, the principal obstacle is concentrated corporate power. So antitrust action is important on both fronts.
Terrific. Well, really appreciate all three of you, John Farrell from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, Anthony Flaccavento with our Rural New Deal, and Michael Shuman, our expert commentator. Will be circling back to you at the end of the next session. thank you all very much. Our next session is a little bit of a shift. We've been talking about building community wealth. Our next segment is about building individual wealth, some kitchen table economics, but it's also social action that we can take to build individual wealth. And our next solutionary I'd like to welcome to the stage is Doug Ryan, who is Vice President of Prosperity Now, an organization dedicated to transforming our economy to work for everyone. Doug Ryan has a broad and deep career in affordable housing, community development, and human services, with extensive experience in both federal and local programs. Doug Ryan, welcome to the Solutions Summit.
Great. Thank you, Eleanor, for having me.
Good. And you must be a relative, Doug, because Ryan is my grandmother's maiden name. So we're probably connected back in a tribe back there in Ireland at some point.
Yeah, we're dime a dozen. Yeah, absolutely.
So, Doug, I'm really interested to learn more about your work. I've been tracking Prosperity Now since I interviewed your founder, Robert Friedman, who I love. What a wonderful, wonderful man. He's the heir to the Levi Strauss fortune, and then spent his entire life how to help other people, help working people get capital so that they can have greater economic security in their lives. So if you would please just give some opening remarks for up to 4 minutes. What are you doing that can help working people get capital and training so that they can build wealth in their families?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the kind words about Bob Friedman, a great leader, and founded this organization as the Corporation for Enterprise Development in 1979. So we're about to have our 45th anniversary next year, and that's exciting. We really appreciate his leadership on all these issues, many of which we'll talk about this afternoon. So just broadly, Prosperity Now, we changed our name in 2017 from CFED. We are a national-based nonprofit. We're in Washington, D.C., that works across the country with partners in every state, and we work to address the racial wealth gap. And that means making sure that all the policy and programmatic solutions and ideas that we are scaling or advocating and educating folks on is aimed to increase economic well-being and economic security for every American, and particularly those who have been marginalized by our public policies over the centuries, and including those who are at the margins of our economic well-being today. So those are really key things that we have to consider every time we take a new initiative or continue an initiative. And what those issue areas are that we're focused on, there are a couple. So we don't pretend to be an expert in everything, but we have a couple core areas that we want to move forward because we believe that we have the expertise and the capacity and the partnerships to do so. So we work on a number of areas. We work on tax policy with a focus on things like the child tax credit that expired last year, and we'll talk a little bit more about that this afternoon. We work on affordable housing and affordable home ownership because housing stability and housing ownership are really keys to people's financial well-being, and that's been a cornerstone of intergenerational wealth transfers in this country for a century plus in the kind of the modern era of housing in the United States. We also talk about entrepreneurship and small business development, particularly for business owners and future business owners of color. So we talk about capital access, technical assistance, things like that, in order to not just start businesses, but to sustain businesses and grow businesses, because that's really the key. Starting businesses is one thing, but making sure that they're sustainable is something altogether. And then we talk about other things, and I will spend a little bit more time on this a little bit later on child and family wealth. That's a broad topic, but that includes such areas as baby bonds. Michael Shuman earlier presentation talked about a different kind of baby bonds, small municipal bonds, reflecting the size of the purchase of the bond. But what baby bonds in our context is an investment in newborn children that are low income or very low income, and will benefit from the growth of that wealth that investment when they turn 18 or whatever the threshold age is, so they can invest in their adulthood. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We talk about a number of other areas that touch on these things, but those are the key issue areas that we're focused on. And there's, of course, a lot of overlap between them. I can talk a little bit about that in the future, but it's really just fundamentally building out family wealth and family financial security.
Terrific. That's great work. I love that investing in children and family. Terrific work. So I'm going to start kind of big picture with you. Your group has a very powerful vision, and I'm going to quote it. It's, "We envision an economy that is just, fair, and free from structural racism, one where every person, family, and community has the power to build sustainable wealth and prosperity." I love that vision. It's totally in alignment with our conversation today about how do we broaden prosperity. And how would you, kind of in the big picture, how does Prosperity Now work to make that vision a reality?
Yeah, that's really the ultimate question for us, and that kind of informs what we do every day and when we take on a new program or a new initiative. So I think we have to start with a couple of kind of baseline ideas that kind of drive this question. So one is, we know that about 10% of the wealthiest Americans in this country, wealthiest Americans have about 69-70% of all the wealth in the U.S. And the bottom 50%, so half of the country, has about 2% of the wealth that's accumulated in this country. That's some data from earlier this year, from early 2023. So that's where we are now. That's the baseline. And I think we can all see around us how wealth has become more concentrated in certain communities, in certain industries, and among certain people, of course, even in the most extreme cases. So that's part of it. The second piece is that we know that Black Americans, Latino Americans in particular, have much lower wealth than white Americans. The white families have typically 10 different numbers, 10 to 15 times the wealth of their Black and Latino neighbors. And that's a challenge as well. So that kind of underscores where that is as well. And we have to talk about why that is and how that informs the decisions we want to move forward. So it speaks to a couple things. I mentioned baby bonds as a tool to address intergenerational wealth that hasn't really been tested. There's research on the effectiveness of it, but since they've only been launched in 2 jurisdictions, Connecticut and Washington, D.C., they obviously haven't been realized yet. But I want to talk a little bit more about those 2 initiatives and how we want to bring this nationally. But those are kinds of the thoughts, what we're thinking. And then finally, just as another example, homeownership. We know that homeownership is what a lot of families aspire to at some point, but it's becoming even more and more difficult as we speak. But we also know is that parents who are homeowners are more likely to have children to become homeowners than say the rental parent counterparts. And that's important because that, again, that frames the question of intergenerational wealth and what our priorities are. So to break this cycle of lack of wealth, we need to build up this generation to ensure future generations have that wealth as well.
Yeah, that's great. And by the way, your audio is a little light, so if you could, when you talk again, speak up a little bit, that would be great.
Okay.
Yeah. Part of what I love about the work of Prosperity Now is that you talk about the disparity between the wealthy, like the top 10%, and then those struggling financially. It's shocking. I'm just going to repeat what you said. It's shocking that the bottom 50% of people in the United States have only 2% of the assets. So that means half the country are just like getting by the skin of their teeth. And that's where we're probably getting the $1 trillion in credit card debt, people trying to pay the bills by putting onto their credit card. But sometimes when you look at that disparity, between the very wealthy and then those struggling financially, which is the vast majority of Americans right now, you kind of wonder, where do we begin to make the changes that are needed to build up prosperity among people who don't have much wealth at all? And I'm all for wealth. I love that. I love America. I love we've got a system. You got an idea, build a company, build a product, get out there, go for it. And I love that you become a millionaire. And I want to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to do that, including good education and good food and safe neighborhoods and all of those things that enable you to be able to build your own company. But it's such a big disparity, and you wonder, where do we begin to make that change? And what I like about Prosperity Now is you recognize that even small amounts of money can make a big difference in the lives of many working people. Just a couple of $1,000 help you get a good education, help you get a car so you can go to work, maybe help you put a down payment on to a condo or something. What would you say are some of the proven approaches to increasing prosperity for all?
There's a couple of things. In one difficult question here, though, is how to what's the time frame we're talking about. A lot of these interventions that we're talking about will take time to be realized, and it takes a really long time. It's going to take a long time for this country to build enough housing to satisfy the demand, and because of zoning rules and all those things, which we advocate for the change, and we can talk a little bit about that. And things like, let me talk about two pieces that I think are really important to understand, I think, to help answer your question. One is the child tax credit that expired, the form of which expired. Of course, there's still a child tax credit that exists on the tax books today, but the expanded child tax credit that became law in early 2021, which was refundable, meaning that it was available to families who didn't have a tax liability. That's really important. It reduced the child poverty rate in this country to about 5%, give or take. When it expired last year, that poverty rate jumped to over 12%. That's an extraordinary piece of evidence to suggest that, as you said, a few $1,000s, it was depending on the income of the family and the number of children, it was $3,000 to $3,500 per child in that expanded tax credit. Meaning, again, it was available to the poorest among us, and that's really important. So we know that just a couple $1,000s in the tax code directed to those who need it most can move the needle considerably. And we know from research of a lot of great partners that looked at and talked to the families that benefited from it, that did exactly what you spoke to. It helped them repair their car, catch up on bills, make sure their utilities were paid, pay for childcare so they could go back to work during the pandemic. That is gargantuan. The childcare crisis in this country is immense for young families. It helped some families save for a down payment for home ownership. The home ownership rate for Black Americans increased a little bit in that time frame. And that was part of it. These were all good things because those are all investments in our future, in our community's future. And again, that only was a couple $1,000s, give or take, per family, again, depending on the income and the number of children in that household. But that's proven. We let it expire. That is an absolute mistake that we made. And we have to, anybody who's listening to this or anybody who catches, a listen to this later on the recording should really focus on how we can make that possible again. So that's one example. And then talking about the long-term investment in families in order to assure prosperity, there's another question. And I talked about baby bonds. So I want to talk about baby bonds in Connecticut, which is the first state. Washington, D.C. is the other jurisdiction. But Connecticut is the first state to enact the baby bonds program. So basically, in a high-level answer to what that is, it's an investment by the state of Connecticut in children who are a qualified family for Medicaid. They call it Husky Care in Connecticut. Each child who is born after July 1 of this year gets an investment from the state of $3,200, which is which the Treasury Department for the state of Connecticut controls. When that child becomes an adult, he or she is eligible to access it to purchase an asset, a home in Connecticut, a business in Connecticut, secondary education, or retirement savings. That's a long-term investment because a lot of us have purchased things like 529s for our children, right? But those are disproportionately favoring the wealthy among us, right? Whose kids would probably already go to college. This is an opportunity to do something different. It's also an opportunity to help the families who couldn't afford to save for home ownership because their parents weren't homeowners, their parents suffered from mental instability. That 18, 20 years down the road, they have an opportunity to have a down payment and move forward with a home purchase in Connecticut, or hopefully the dozens of other states that we hope to enact something similar if the federal government doesn't get to it, which of course is the solution. So those are two examples: baby bonds, kind of the long game, and child tax credit, which we could once again do immediately if we had the wherewithal and frankly the commitment to addressing child poverty in this country. So I think those are two good examples, as you said, a few $1,000s. And we could argue we don't have that money. Well, our tax code does have that money. It's just where our priorities lay. And that's one of the things that we're trying to advocate for. We want to make sure that legislators at the state level and in Congress understand that our priority should be with the people who are most in need, but also the next generation.
Right, exactly. I think of that now when I see the baby carriages in my neighborhood. I go, oh, feed this child well, educate this child well, because that's going to be what's feeding into my Social Security when I retire. So, it's really in our self-interest, other than just generally, yes, we want America and the humanity to prosper, but it's also for our own best interest that people are on healthy food, good education, on a good track, so they're not out there causing trouble, beating us up on the head, or going to jail. And it's better for everyone to do well. I would invite our participants here to put your questions in the question box. And while your questions are coming in, I invite our expert commentator, Michael Shuman, back to the stage. Michael, did you have a question or comment for Doug Ryan about Prosperity Now?
Yeah, so I think the work that you're doing is really exciting. And I wonder if you've thought about some of the ways that grassroots investors, that is non-accredited, non-wealthy people, can in fact invest in some of the things you're talking about, and if there's some examples out there of that.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think we'd have to think a little bit about that, what that would look like. So those are some, community-based investment programs are really a good idea. And I do think, for example, there's an opportunity in the housing space, depending on what that would look like, to invest in cooperatives, to invest in land trusts, to invest in things like that can lower the barrier to entry to housing and home ownership, the cost of land, essentially, which is the most prohibitive cost in housing in this country, and certainly in most metropolitan areas. So I think that's an opportunity to think about. Another way, frankly, is for families and businesses to put deposits in community development credit unions or CDFIs that really serve the community and serve specific purposes. There are a lot of good CDFIs in this country. A lot of them got a good investment during the COVID crisis to build capacity, but also to build their lending out. And community development credit unions, many of which are CDFIs, they can do good work, and they often focus not just on a particular geography, which is really important, but maybe a particular sector. Not all CDFIs, for example, invest in small businesses or do home ownership or do personal lending. So building out the CDFI network, and there are a lot of good ones out there, and OFN does good work in this space. We partner with them on a number of areas, but there's an opportunity, I think, to build out the kind of community capital model that really can change the game a little bit. And we also saw with the new rules on the Community Reinvestment Act that came out from the banking regulators earlier this month, and it's 1,500 pages. It's hard to get through at this point, but there we are. I think that's progress as well, and I think people need to look at that and how that can move the needle a little bit. As I think. We're still studying it. We're excited about it. It's a positive move in a direction, but I think building out community financial institutions, which are really important, but they are at risk, is an opportunity to do that. So, and also, frankly, the institutions that we know and trust, universities, nonprofits, where are they banking? There's a question for a lot of organizations to consider too.
Right. That's great, Doug. We're just kind of at the end of this segment. I love what you're talking about with the child tax credit, with the baby bonds, get a few $1,000s into the hands of people who don't have much so that they can build themselves up into a greater prosperity and economic security. Michael, did you have kind of 1 minute on key takeaways from Doug Ryan and the Prosperity Now?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of great stuff that Doug shared. And I guess one of the takeaways I got from it is we can end child poverty. And we almost did it. And then we backed off from it. But the creative use of tax credits, affordable housing, baby bonds can move us forward. I also took away that don't expect immediate results. These are long-term problems. We need long-term dedicated solutions, which is again why this temporary bump in the child tax credit was not enough. And I appreciated his last set of comments about the importance of local financial institutions, CDFIs, community development, credit unions, and the use of anchor institutions, churches, universities, hospitals, and tapping their investment for some of these causes.
That's terrific. Doug, that's all the time we have. So appreciate you taking time out of your important work. Doug Ryan, Vice President of Prosperity Now, thank you so much for being at the Solution Summit with us today.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you both for engaging in this conversation. It's great, and I look forward to learning more and to follow up.
Terrific. And Michael, please stay on. We're now moving into the closing segment of our day today on dealing with economic insecurity, moving into broadening prosperity. I'd appreciate your having a conversation with you about summarizing some of the key learnings of how do we deal with this challenge of a vastly different economic situation, and the fact that the vast majority of Americans are struggling financially now. Over 70% are anxious about their financial situation. So I would appreciate any reflections you have. What did you learn about broadening prosperity from our conversation today? Maybe hit a few of the highlights.
Yeah, so I took a couple of very hopeful things from this. So the first thing was, none of this is, that, as they say, rocket science. There are examples of success that exist already in this country. You don't have to look to Scandinavia or, kibbutzim or whatever else are your favorite, futuristic forms of social organization. We have lots of great examples, but they are disconnected, often at the state and local level. But we saw examples today in finance, in energy, and in food, and in housing. We saw them in urban contexts. We saw them in rural contexts. So it's a question of mobilizing the political will. The second thing that I took is that there is a lot of bipartisan support for many of these initiatives. And that's why I think, especially what Anthony contributed, showing that in rural areas, which are often belittled as being backward, there's lots of creative activity that's going on and often enjoys majority Republican support at the state level. And that kind of politics is very pragmatic, as opposed to the polarizing politics at the national level. And I think that's something to be built on as well. And finally, I heard, and maybe this is just because I'm biased, a through line about the importance of moving our money. Because at the end of the day, all of these innovations, again, in energy, in food, in housing, in childcare, all of these things involve investment and new sources of money. They could, in theory, come from taxation. You can always wave your magic tax wand and bring new money to the table. That seems far-fetched in our current environment. But I think getting people to think about the important ways that they can start moving their money from Wall Street into all of the things that we talked about, that's a real starting point, independent of where people's politics are at.
Yeah, that is a great summary of some of the key points here. And, I love this whole discussion around broadening prosperity because so often when we talk about it, people go right to the unfair taxes, the rich aren't taxed enough, the middle class is taxed too much. So that's kind of a lot of how the conversation is focused. And of course, that's a vital conversation. But this conversation on democratizing our economy and how do we help more of the average American have more prosperity, more wealth, help build it in families, help build it in communities. That conversation, I think, is a vital one that is underserved. So I feel very excited that we brought the idea of democratizing the economy into the conversation in a big way today. One of the thoughts I have is, and it comes from now doing 4 of these Solution Summit days within 2 weeks. We did the climate already. This is broadening prosperity. We've got improving our health is on Tuesday. Strengthening our democracy is next Thursday. I just want to take a minute and talk about some of how these issues interrelate with each other. So we know that this extreme wealth inequality we have, where the top 1% owns 90% of the wealth, is very bad for our democracy because we're seeing wealthy people use their money to influence the policies that then make that favor the rich and keep the whole thing going on to intensifying the vacuuming up of the resources to the very top. So the reverse is also true. When we have greater wealth equality, when we have community wealth building, that's good for democracy. We have more people's voices being heard at the table where decisions are being made. And also another cross current that strikes me is the extreme wealth inequality we have right now is bad for the climate crisis because we're seeing, the wealthy corporations in particular, the fossil fuel companies, and bearing down on policy and media that actually is confusing people and doing disinformation campaigns and blocking action on the climate crisis as we need to move to the renewable green economy. So, and then finally, extreme wealth inequality is really bad for health. That when people are struggling financially, they have a harder time getting access to health care, harder time paying for medicine. They delay going to the doctor, so they get sicker. They can't afford the medicine and treatment to get and stay healthy. So you're kind of in a downward health spiral if you don't have greater wealth to draw on. So those are just a few observations on some of the cross currents because I'm, as you know, deeply enmeshed in all 4 of these areas over the next week.
Yeah. And I would also say that the issue of federalism is really important here. It's important, even though you're in Washington, D.C. Until recently lived in Washington, D.C., so we're very national centric in our views, but a lot of these innovations are happening in a decentralized way. And when you get to an issue like healthcare, now I'm not saying I'm going to say something positive about the Canadian healthcare system, and I don't want this misinterpreted as A, it's perfect, or B, the US should do it. But I do want to say that the Canadian healthcare reforms started really in the 1950s and 60s in the province of Saskatchewan, which is just north of Montana and has a kind of cowboy culture. And it then expanded to other provinces that did some experiments. And even now, even it's called a national healthcare system, but it's highly decentralized and varies a lot from province to province. And I think at a time when our national politics is so polarized and so frozen, it can't even pass the simplest of budgets. I don't think we should give up. I think we should be excited that there are these options at the state and local level that may surprise us about their political origin. We should pay attention to them. We should learn from them, and we should gradually build national policy, not in some back room, but based on the success at the state and local level.
That is a fantastic comment. And I think we might end it there. That's so exactly right. That focus on the state and local, which you have done brilliantly now for decades. How do people find out more about your great work?
So I blog it partially at michaelhschuman.com, and partially I have as I mentioned earlier, I have this publication on local investment called the Main Street Journal, which is mainstreetjournal.substack.subscribe or something like that. You'll get there. But plenty of other actors in this space, and I take a lot of hope from these success stories.
That's terrific. And, it's just what I was talking about, that we've got these solutionaries everywhere. I believe we've got this hidden solutions movement all across the country, people at the local and state level doing incredible work, but it's under the radar, so people don't see it. You see it because you're focusing on it. I so appreciate you writing about it and talking about it and bringing it to our attention. So Michael Shuman, I salute you as a solutionary, and I thank you for your expert commentary all through today about broadening prosperity.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your including me, and may the solutionaries win.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I just have a few closing remarks for our participants here. If you're interested in improving our health, we've got health solutions for our summit on this coming Tuesday, November 14th. If you're concerned about our democracy, we have Strengthening Our Democracy Day on next Thursday, November 16th. Got an amazing lineup there with Francis Moore LePay, and both of those sessions are also going to be 12 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern. And I do want to say the richness of this summit hopefully will be reflected. I am going to write a report about the Solution Summit and the ideas and the conversation here. So hopefully I can get that done before the end of the year. And also we're hoping to do some highlights by video of some of the Solution Summit. And I'm not sure when those will be ready, but we will let you know when the report and the videos are ready. And I want to finally say thank you to the Solution Summit team. I am so grateful to the team of people. I'm in front of the camera here, but there's a big group behind the camera that this would not have happened without you all. So I want to thank in particular Tracy Gary, Gayatri Bala, Janae Wallach, Maggie Lou, Brad Perkins of Better Planet Media, Lila Bala Ladd, Macy Leifer here with me, and Pat Ewing and Sarah Wilson, who helped out early on. Thank you also to Representative Jim McGovern here in the U.S. House, and his able-bodied, wonderful staff person, Bella Ito. A thank you to all our speakers, all our donors, all our sponsors. We're so very grateful. And I want to thank all of you listening. Thank you for being part of the solution. Thank you for being part of the emerging solutions movement, creating a better America and a better world. This is Eleanor LeCain. Until next time, thank you.